Have you ever wondered how a small island in the Caribbean could make the world's greatest empires both covet it and fear the fires it might spark? Cuba, land of cigars, sugar, and music that never falls silent, has been shaped by centuries of conquest, revolution, and confrontation with superpowers. In this video, we will journey through the complete history of Cuba, from its first native civilizations to the storms of the modern age, to understand why its rhythms never stop echoing across the sea. Long before the sails of Spain cut across the horizon, Cuba was not the Cuba we know today. It was a mosaic of rivers, mangrove swamps, dense forests, and open savannas, cradled in the turquoise arms of the Caribbean Sea. There were no stone cathedrals, no cannon-lined harbors, only the hum of insects, the wind moving through palm leaves, and the smell of wood smoke rising from coastal villages. Two peoples called this island home: the Taíno and the Siboney. Their names survive in fragments, scraps of words, pottery shards, faint echoes in place names. The Siboney, believed to be among the earliest settlers, lived mostly along the western regions. They were hunter-gatherers, quiet travelers between sea and forest, moving with the seasons, leaving behind tools carved from shell and bone. The Taíno, arriving later from the northern reaches of South America, carried with them agriculture, a richer social structure, and a way of life tied to the rhythms of the earth. The Taíno villages were clusters of bohíos, round thatched roof houses built from palm trunks and woven fibers. At dawn, women stepped out into the soft light to tend cassava fields, their bare feet pressing into the dark, fertile soil. Men pushed their canoas out to sea, paddling past coral reefs to fish for snapper and grouper. Children played in the shallows, their laughter carried by the wind. In the evenings, the community gathered for arreitos, ceremonial dances that braided together song, storytelling, and prayer. These were not just festivities. They were the lifeblood of Taíno memory, a way to bind the living to the spirits of the ancestors. Their belief system saw the island as a living being. Rivers had souls, the sea had moods, the spirits of the dead returned in the flight of birds. Zemi idols, small carved figures, embodied gods of rain, fertility, and the crops that sustained life. The Taíno were not naive to hardship. Hurricanes could flatten their homes, and hunger could gnaw at the villages when the sea was rough. But life moved in cycles, and each trial was part of a world they believed they belonged to. When the first Europeans would arrive, they would write about these people as gentle, generous, and fit to be ruled. But in this moment, centuries before that encounter, the Taíno and Siboney were sovereign in their own right. Their politics were local, led by caciques whose authority was balanced by the community's needs. Trade connected different villages. Polished stone axes and beads traveled from one side of the island to the other. Disputes were settled without the kind of wars that would soon be carried here from across the ocean. This was a world without maps, without borders, only the endless sky above and the steady tides below. And yet, for all its quiet, the island was not empty of history. It had its own epic, unwritten but deeply known, a story passed from elder to child under the glow of a fire. The Taíno and Siboney could not have imagined the changes that would come, or how quickly their way of life would vanish once the white sails appeared on the horizon. The sea had always brought them fish, shells, and trade from other islands. But soon, it would bring something else. Strangers who spoke in alien tongues, whose eyes measured land and bodies as possessions. And with them, the old rhythms would begin to falter. It began with a glint of white against the deep blue horizon. The Taíno fishermen, paddling their canoas beyond the reefs, may have thought it was a cloud, low and strange. But it moved against the wind, tall and deliberate, like nothing they had seen before. In October 1492, Christopher Columbus anchored off the coast of Cuba, believing he had reached the fringes of Asia. His diary, written in the confident hand of a man who thought the world was his to name, spoke of a most beautiful land, full of trees and flowers, and very fertile. Columbus did not come alone. His ships carried the smell of Europe, salted meat, tar, and iron, and men whose eyes burned with a mixture of awe and hunger. They saw in Cuba not just beauty, but opportunity. Gold that might be hidden in rivers, timber for masts, land for plantations, and people to serve as labor. To the Taíno and Ciboney who welcomed them with food, water, and shelter, these strangers seemed at first like guests. Mysterious, yes, but not yet a threat. The first encounters were polite, even ceremonial. Columbus and his men were offered tobacco leaves, brightly woven cotton, and cassava bread. The Spaniards in return gave beads, bells, and trinkets, objects that glittered but carried no real value back home. Yet beneath the surface of these exchanges lay a truth that would soon become impossible to ignore. The Spanish had not come to trade, but to claim. In the months and years that followed, ships returned, not just with sailors, but with soldiers, priests, and administrators. Crosses were planted in the soil, alongside banners bearing the royal arms of Castile and Aragon. The Spanish crown declared Cuba part of its empire without asking, as though the island had been waiting centuries for such an announcement. They came armed not only with steel and gunpowder, but with an entire worldview, one in which land could be owned outright, where kings ruled by divine right, and where those who worshipped differently were seen as lost souls to be saved. Priests began baptizing the Taíno, reciting prayers in a language the islanders did not understand. In the shadow of these ceremonies, soldiers measured land and divided it into encomiendas, grants that gave Spanish settlers the right to use indigenous labor in exchange for promises of protection and Christian instruction. The reality was far from protective. Fields once worked for the community were now bent toward Spanish demands. Cutting timber, mining for gold, and planting the first sugarcane shoots that would one day define Cuba's economy. Diseases like smallpox arrived silently, spreading faster than Spanish words or gunfire. Villages emptied in weeks. Entire family lines vanished. For the Taíno, the arrival of the Spanish was not just the appearance of strangers. It was the beginning of a slow collapse. Their songs still rose into the night air, but now they mingled with the clang of iron tools, the shouted orders of foreign overseers, and the ever-present sound of axes biting into forest. Columbus left, but Spain remained. Havana had not yet been built, but the seeds of conquest had been sown, and their roots were already tightening around the island. Cuba had entered a new chapter, not by choice, but by force. And the world it had known for thousands of years was already slipping beneath the tide. By the early 1500s, Cuba was no longer a remote island on the edge of maps. It had become a cog in the sprawling machine of the Spanish Empire, valued not for its people, but for what could be taken from its soil, its forests, and its seas. The age of conquest gave way to the age of extraction. The encomienda system, first introduced with promises of mutual benefit, hardened into something far more ruthless. In practice, it meant that Spanish settlers were granted control over vast tracts of land and the right to demand labor from the surviving Taíno. Those who resisted were punished. Those who submitted often worked themselves into early graves. The gold that trickled from Cuban rivers was small compared to the riches of Mexico or Peru, but it was enough to keep the Spanish crown interested. When the shallow deposits ran dry, the island's purpose shifted. The future of Cuba would not be written in gold dust, but in sugar crystals. Spanish colonists planted the first large-scale sugarcane fields, bringing with them the techniques and ambitions that would transform the island into a plantation society. To the European eye, sugar was more than a sweetener. It was wealth you could hold in your hands, store in barrels, and sell across oceans. Havana began to rise from the marshes and sands of the northern coast, its harbor deep enough to shelter fleets. Soon it became the central port for Spain's treasure convoys, the massive armadas carrying gold, silver, and goods between the New World and Europe. Every ship that docked brought something with it: tools, weapons, clothing, and ideas from across the Atlantic. But they also brought the constant threat of piracy. French and English corsairs, hearing of Havana's strategic role, stalked its waters, waiting for a chance to strike. To protect its jewel, Spain ringed Havana with stone. Massive fortifications like Castillo de la Real Fuerza and later El Morro rose above the shoreline. Their cannons pointed toward the horizon. These walls were not just military defenses. They were symbols of power. Reminders that Cuba was a guarded possession, an essential link in an empire's chain. Inside those walls, colonial life unfolded in rigid layers. At the top stood the Spanish-born elites, governors, merchants, and military officers, who controlled the economy and dictated policy. Below them were the criollos, people of Spanish descent born in Cuba, who often chafed under the authority of the crown, but still benefited from the system. At the bottom were those who did the work, the dwindling population of indigenous laborers, and increasingly the enslaved Africans who were beginning to arrive in small numbers to replace them. In the countryside, the land was stripped and reshaped. Forests fell to make room for fields. Streams were diverted to feed the mills, and the rhythm of life shifted to match the grinding of sugarcane rollers. The air grew thick with the scent of molasses, sweet and heavy, masking the sweat and suffering it took to produce. Cuba was no longer an island of self-contained villages and sacred groves. It had become a piece of Europe's economic puzzle, valuable, vulnerable, and watched. Every harvest, every ship, every ounce of sugar tied it tighter to the demands of the empire. And though the wealth left its shores, the cost was paid in lives that would never be counted. By the mid-16th century, the faces of Cuba were changing. The gentle rhythms of Taíno life, cassava fields, fishing canoas, songs by firelight, were now little more than memories held in the minds of the few survivors. Disease had done what swords alone could not. Smallpox, measles, and influenza moved invisibly through villages, striking faster than anyone could bury the dead. In some places, entire communities vanished within a single season. The Spanish chroniclers recorded the decline with cold precision, tallying numbers as though counting cattle. From perhaps several 100,000 at the time of contact, the indigenous population collapsed to a few thousand within decades. Those who remained were folded into the colonial economy, their traditions diluted, their languages fading under the weight of Spanish words and Catholic prayers. The Zemi idols were gone, either smashed or hidden in earth, and the old gods' names were whispered only in secret. Yet the empire's hunger for labor did not diminish with the loss of its native workforce. Sugarcane, tobacco, and cattle demanded hands, thousands of them. And so, Spain looked outward, across the Atlantic, toward the great slave markets of West Africa. The transatlantic slave trade, already feeding the plantations of Hispaniola and Brazil, now extended its reach to Cuba. The first slave ships docked in Havana's harbor in the early 1500s, their human cargo packed in the dark holds, chained and starving. The captives came from diverse kingdoms and cultures: Yoruba, Congo, Mandinka, forced together by violence into a single, brutal category: property. Their arrival marked a new layer of Cuba's identity, one that would shape its culture, economy, and music for centuries. But born from suffering so deep, it left scars across generations. The African presence in Cuba was not just physical labor. It became a quiet act of cultural survival. In the fields, under the watch of overseers, rhythms from the mother continent found their way into work songs. At night, in hidden gatherings, the drum beats of Bata and the chants of Yoruba religion resurfaced, reshaping themselves to survive alongside Catholic saints. This blending, forced yet resilient, was the root of Cuba's syncretic spiritual traditions like Santeria, where African deities wore the faces of Christian icons. But for the enslaved, daily life was unrelenting. The plantations were machines designed to extract every ounce of labor possible. The sun was an overseer as much as the whip, and both marked the skin in different ways. In the grinding mills, sugarcane juice ran like rivers, but its sweetness never reached those who cut and crushed it. Death from exhaustion, malnutrition, or punishment was not an exception. It was a constant. Havana's streets reflected the new social order. At the docks, European merchants, African laborers, and mixed-race artisans crossed paths in a city where wealth and bondage lived side by side. The Spanish elite counted profits from their plantations, while the enslaved counted the days, sometimes the hours, until they might escape or rebel. By the end of the 16th century, Cuba was no longer the land of its first peoples. The Taíno and Ciboney were almost entirely gone. Their voices silenced, but not erased. Traces lingered in place names, in the curve of a fishing boat, in the bitter tang of cassava bread, still eaten in rural homes. In their absence, the island had become a crucible of displacement, where Europe, Africa, and what little remained of the indigenous world were being forced together in the heat of empire. And in that crucible, something new, both beautiful and brutal, was beginning to form. By the 17th century, Cuba had become more than just another colony. It was a keystone in Spain's imperial arc. Positioned at the mouth of the Gulf of Mexico, Havana sat like a watchman between the old world and the new. Every treasure fleet carrying silver from Mexico or gold from Peru passed within reach of its harbor. For the Spanish crown, losing Cuba would be like leaving the empire's back door unguarded. Havana grew into a city of stone. Fortresses rose above the shoreline, their bastions angled to deflect cannon fire, their walls thick enough to swallow echoes. Castillo de la Real Fuerza, begun in the 1550s, was the first taste of this transformation, a squat, square sentinel guarding the entrance to the harbor. Later, El Morro Castle took shape. Its lighthouse, a warning to friend and foe alike, its guns aimed at the open sea. These defenses were not paranoia, they were necessity. The Caribbean was a hunting ground for pirates and privateers, many sanctioned by Spain's rivals. In 1555, the French corsair Jacques de Sorres attacked Havana, burning much of the city. English captains like Francis Drake stalked these waters, their eyes on the treasure fleets that left Havana each summer. To Spain, Cuba was both shield and prize, too valuable to neglect, too tempting to leave unfortified. Inside the city, the rhythm of colonial life beat in time with the empire's needs. Docks were crowded with galleons loading sugar, tobacco, and hides, while unloading flour, wine, and manufactured goods from Spain. Merchants' houses faced the plazas, their arcaded walkways offering shade from the tropical sun. Churches and convents rose alongside administrative buildings, each one a declaration of Spain's civilizing mission, or, as the colonizers saw it, their divine right. But Havana's prosperity was not evenly felt. For every merchant counting profits in a shaded courtyard, there were hundreds of laborers, enslaved and free, hauling crates in the heat, manning the shipyards, or cutting cane on estates beyond the city walls. The wealth that passed through Cuba rarely stayed. It was funneled back to Europe, leaving behind a veneer of grandeur built on fragile foundations. In the countryside, plantations multiplied, stretching inland from the coasts. Sugar, tobacco, and cattle dominated the economy, each crop or herd bound for export. Roads were cut through the jungle to link estates to the ports. Bridges and aqueducts followed, not for the comfort of the locals, but to keep goods flowing toward the ships. The land itself was becoming a servant to empire, reshaped for the sake of distant markets. Yet, for all its fortifications, Cuba remained vulnerable, not only to foreign attack, but to the simmering unrest within. The blending of cultures, forced and voluntary, was creating a population unlike any in Spain's other territories. African rhythms, Spanish guitar, and what little survived of Taíno melody were already weaving together in the island's music. Markets buzzed with languages and dialects from 3 continents. And in the back rooms of taverns and private homes, whispers of resistance began to stir. Cuba was the empire's fortress, but it was also a living crossroads. Every ship that entered Havana's harbor brought goods, news, and ideas. And sometimes, those ideas were dangerous. The walls could keep out enemy fleets, but they could not contain the growing sense that the island's destiny might one day break free from Spain's grasp. For more than 2 centuries, Cuba had lived under the weight of the Spanish crown, its laws, its taxes, and its soldiers. But no empire lasts without friction. Beneath the surface of Havana's stone plazas and the cane fields' neat rows, resentment began to move like an underground current, slow, invisible, and dangerous. The earliest resistance came not from formal armies, but from those who had the least to lose. Enslaved Africans and their descendants fled plantations into the interior, forming maroon communities hidden in the mountains and forests. These settlements, sometimes called palenques, became havens for the escaped, places where Spanish authority could not easily reach. Here, African traditions survived more freely. Drums beat at night, crops were planted in familiar patterns, and a different vision of freedom, however fragile, took root. By the late 18th century, the political climate across the Atlantic world was shifting. The American Revolution had shown that a colony could break from its master. The Haitian Revolution, closer to home, struck a deeper chord and a deeper fear among Cuba's ruling class. In 1791, enslaved people in Saint-Domingue rose against their French masters, eventually creating the first independent Black republic in the Americas. To Cuba's enslaved population, this was a beacon. To its planters, it was a warning, written in blood. Spain's grip tightened. Laws grew harsher, punishments swifter. But repression could not erase the slow spread of radical thought. Cuban-born criollos, descendants of Spaniards who had never set foot in Europe, began to question why they should live under policies dictated from Madrid. Many were wealthy, educated, and influential. Yet their political power was limited by the fact that they were not peninsulares, Spaniards born in Spain. Whispers of autonomy and reform began to pass in private salons and merchant offices. Newspapers, censored but not silent, hinted at ideas of liberalism and self-governance. The Napoleonic invasion of Spain in 1808 cracked open the door further. With the mother country in chaos, Some in Cuba wondered if loyalty was still in their best interest. Yet open revolt was dangerous. Spain's military presence on the island was formidable, and the planters feared that a rebellion could unleash a Haitian-style uprising that might consume them as well. The result was a tense balance, reformists and loyalists eyeing each other warily, knowing that either path carried risk. Still, the island could not remain untouched. Smugglers and sailors brought news from other colonies, Venezuela, Mexico, and Colombia, where independence movements were gaining ground. Young Cuban intellectuals traveled abroad and returned with dangerous questions. Why should Havana's wealth feed Madrid while local poverty deepened? Why should Cuban sons die in Spain's wars but have no say in their own governance? By the early 19th century, these questions were no longer whispered only in elite circles. They began to appear in the conversations of artisans, freedmen, and even some soldiers. The fortress was not yet under siege, but hairline cracks were spreading across its walls. The Spanish crown still saw Cuba as the ever-faithful isle, the last jewel that would not slip from its grasp. But in the streets of Havana and the shadows of the cane fields, the first sparks of a fire had been lit, small enough to stamp out, but bright enough to be seen from far away. The first spark came on October 10, 1868, in the town of Yara. Carlos Manuel de Céspedes, a wealthy planter turned revolutionary, stood before a small group of armed men and read aloud the Grito de Yara, declaring Cuba's independence from Spain. In that same moment, he freed the enslaved workers on his estate and called them to join the cause. The act was both moral and strategic. In a colony where sugar fields were worked by tens of thousands in chains, no uprising could succeed without them. The war that followed, the 10 Years' War, was not a clean march to freedom. It was a grinding conflict of ambushes, skirmishes, and punishing counterattacks. The Cuban rebels, known as Mambises, fought in the countryside, using the land's dense forests and marshes to their advantage. They were poorly equipped, often wielding machetes in place of rifles. But they carried something Spain's soldiers did not: a vision of an island free from imperial chains. Spain answered with overwhelming force. Troops poured in from the peninsula, armed with modern rifles and backed by gunboats along the coast. The war left the countryside scorched, villages burned, crops destroyed, families torn apart. The Spanish military, unable to fully crush the rebellion, sought instead to starve it, driving civilians into fortified towns in what amounted to early reconcentration policies. Disease and hunger claimed as many lives as bullets. After a decade, the rebels were exhausted. The Pact of Zanjón in 1878 ended the war without granting full independence. Some reforms were promised. Slavery would be abolished in the coming years. But the dream of a sovereign Cuba remained unfulfilled. For many, it was a bitter peace, a pause rather than an end. The pause lasted less than 2 decades. By the 1890s, a new generation had taken up the cause, inspired by the words and martyrdom of José Martí, a writer, organizer, and visionary who believed Cuba's struggle was tied to the broader fight against oppression everywhere. Martí understood that independence would require unity across race and class, and he worked tirelessly to bring exiles, veterans, and workers into a single movement. In 1895, the call to arms rang out again. Martí returned to Cuba alongside generals like Máximo Gómez and Antonio Maceo, launching the War of Independence. Martí would not live to see it through. He was killed in battle within weeks. But his ideas became the rebellion's moral compass. This second war was even more brutal. Spain deployed General Valeriano Weyler, whose reconcentration policy herded rural populations into camps where disease and starvation ravaged tens of thousands. Entire swaths of the countryside became silent, abandoned landscapes, the cane fields left to rot. Yet the Mambises endured, fighting without steady supplies. They waged guerrilla campaigns, striking at outposts and rail lines, forcing Spain to spread its forces thin. The war drained the empire's resources and eroded its will. But total victory still seemed distant, until another power, watching from across the Florida Straits, decided to intervene. The next chapter of Cuba's struggle would not be decided solely by Cubans and Spaniards. The United States was about to step onto the stage, and with it, the island's fate would turn in a new and unpredictable direction. By the final years of the 19th century, the Cuban War of Independence had become a slow-burning agony. Spain bleeding resources it could not replace, Cuban fighters refusing to surrender despite the famine, and the land itself reduced to ash. Across the Straits of Florida, the United States watched. Officially, Washington declared neutrality. Unofficially, the sympathy of the American public leaned toward the Cuban cause, stirred by lurid newspaper reports of Spanish atrocities and the romantic image of a small island fighting a mighty empire. Then, on the night of February 15, 1898, the USS Maine, anchored in Havana Harbor, exploded without warning. The blast ripped through the battleship's hull, killing over 260 American sailors. The cause was unclear: an accident in the coal bunkers, a Spanish mine, or sabotage. But in the United States, the verdict was swift. "Remember the Maine, to hell with Spain," became the cry that swept the country. In April, the U.S. Congress declared war on Spain. For Cuba, the arrival of the American military was both a salvation and a shadow. The war that followed lasted barely 4 months, but would determine the island's future for decades. The conflict unfolded on 2 fronts, land and sea. On the ground, American troops landed in eastern Cuba, joining Cuban Mambises in pushing against Spanish positions. The Battle of San Juan Hill, with the so-called Rough Riders under Theodore Roosevelt, became a symbol in American memory, though Cuban fighters had been waging such battles for years before the U.S. arrived. In truth, the Cuban contribution was decisive, but the narrative that emerged often left them in the margins. At sea, the U.S. Navy shattered Spain's Caribbean fleet in the Battle of Santiago de Cuba. The Spanish ships, cornered in the harbor, attempted a desperate escape and were sunk or grounded in flames. Without naval support, Spain's position in Cuba collapsed. By August, an armistice was signed. The Treaty of Paris, concluded in December 1898, marked the end of Spain's once vast empire in the Americas. Cuba was declared independent, but the fine print told another story. U.S. forces would occupy the island until a stable government was formed. Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines passed directly into American hands. For Cubans who had fought and starved for their freedom, the moment was bittersweet. The Spanish flag came down, but the American flag rose in its place. Washington insisted that its presence was temporary, a bridge to self-government. Yet military governors now ran Havana, and the decisions shaping the island's future were being made in Washington, not Santiago de Cuba or Camagüey. In the streets of Havana, the people celebrated the end of Spanish rule. But the celebration carried an undercurrent of uncertainty. The foreign soldiers marching past the city's colonial facades were not speaking Spanish. The cannons that had once been aimed at Spanish ships now faced an empty sea, but their owners were new. The war had freed Cuba from Madrid's grasp. But freedom, it seemed, came with a new set of hands ready to hold the reins. The island had changed empires. But whether it had truly changed masters was a question that would haunt the coming decades. On May 20th, 1902, the Cuban flag rose above Havana for the first time as the national standard of an independent republic. Crowds gathered in the plazas, cheering, waving small paper flags, feeling the rush of a moment that generations had dreamed of. Yet behind the celebration stood the shadow of another flag, the Stars and Stripes, its presence still heavy in the air. The U.S. military withdrew, but not before ensuring that its influence would be written into Cuba's very constitution. The Platt Amendment, passed by the U.S. Congress and imposed on Cuba in 1901, gave Washington the right to intervene in Cuban affairs whenever it deemed necessary. It also secured American control over the newly leased naval base at Guantanamo Bay. In effect, Cuba's sovereignty existed within boundaries drawn elsewhere. The first years of the Republic revealed the weight of those invisible chains. American companies poured investment into sugar, tobacco, and infrastructure, not as partners, but as owners. Vast stretches of fertile land passed into foreign hands. Havana's skyline grew with new hotels, offices, and theaters. But the profits flowed north, leaving the countryside locked in poverty. Political life was turbulent. Elections were marked by corruption, patronage, and at times, outright violence. When instability threatened to spiral out of control, American troops returned, intervening in 1906, again in 1912, and keeping the unspoken message clear. Independence had its limits. For the sugar industry, those limits were even sharper. Cuba's economy was built almost entirely on the export of sugar to the U.S., a dependency that made the island vulnerable to fluctuations in world prices and the policies of foreign markets. In good years, the mills ran day and night, and Havana's elites held lavish parties in ballrooms lit by crystal chandeliers. In bad years, rural workers went hungry, and debt spread like a shadow across the cane fields. Culturally, Havana in the early 20th century was a paradox, a city of elegance and vice. Jazz and rumba spilled from clubs where American tourists danced alongside Cuban elites. The Malecon seawall, stretching along the harbor, became a promenade where young couples strolled under lamplight. But behind the glitter was a network of corruption. Politicians in the pockets of U.S. business interests, police bribed by gangsters, and an increasingly visible presence of the American mafia, which turned Havana into a playground for gambling and illicit deals. In the countryside, the dream of independence felt distant. Small farmers struggled under debts to sugar mills. Former rebels, once hailed as heroes, found themselves sidelined in politics or working as minor officials in a system that had no place for their ideals. The revolutionary spirit had not vanished. It lay dormant, biding its time. By the 1930s, economic depression, political unrest, and a growing nationalist movement would shake the Republic's fragile foundations. The Cuban people had their own government, their own flag, their own anthem. But the sense lingered that the island was still living under watchful eyes from across the water. Independence had been achieved, yes, but it was an independence measured, monitored, and never entirely free. By the mid-20th century, Cuba had become a nation of two faces. In Havana, neon lights flickered over casinos, nightclubs, and hotels, where American tourists gambled away fortunes and sipped rum beneath ceiling fans. The city pulsed with music, mambo, sun, and jazz blending into something uniquely Cuban. But beyond the city limits, a different Cuba stretched for miles. Cane fields where laborers earned barely enough to eat, villages without electricity, children who had never seen a doctor. The Republic's politics had grown cynical, corrupted by decades of patronage and deals brokered in smoke-filled rooms. In 1952, Fulgencio Batista, a former army sergeant who had already ruled once in the 1940s, returned to power through a military coup. His regime promised stability but delivered repression. Elections were suspended, dissent was silenced, and those who opposed him risked imprisonment or worse. It was in this atmosphere that a young lawyer named Fidel Castro emerged. Charismatic, ambitious, and deeply convinced that Cuba needed a radical break from its past, Castro gathered a small group of rebels. In 1953, they launched an ill-fated attack on the Moncada barracks in Santiago de Cuba. The assault failed, and many rebels were killed or captured. But the event marked the beginning of a movement. Castro was imprisoned, then exiled to Mexico, where he met Ernesto Che Guevara, an Argentine doctor turned revolutionary. Together, they plotted a return. In December 1956, aboard a small yacht named Granma, Castro, Guevara, and fewer than 100 men landed on Cuba's eastern shore. Most were killed or captured in the first days, but a handful escaped into the Sierra Maestra mountains. From there, the rebellion began to grow. The guerrillas fought with hit-and-run tactics, sabotaging Batista's forces, seizing weapons, and winning the support of peasants by promising land reform and justice. The war was as much about perception as it was about territory. Batista's government, plagued by corruption and brutality, was losing legitimacy both at home and abroad. Reports of torture, political killings, and stolen elections alienated even his allies in Washington. Meanwhile, the rebels' image, young men in olive green fatigues, speaking of dignity and freedom, captured the imagination of Cubans across class lines. By late 1958, Batista's control was crumbling. Rebel columns advanced westward, cutting supply lines and taking key towns. On January 1, 1959, as Havana celebrated New Year's Eve, Batista fled the country, leaving behind a vacuum that the rebels quickly filled. Crowds poured into the streets, cheering, waving flags, embracing strangers. Castro entered Havana days later, greeted as a liberator. But liberation would soon take on a different meaning. Land was seized from large estates and redistributed. Foreign-owned businesses were nationalized. Opposition voices were silenced, and former allies who questioned the new order found themselves in prison or exile. Cuba declared itself socialist, aligning with the Soviet Union in the midst of the Cold War. The revolution had succeeded in overthrowing Batista, but it had also replaced one form of concentrated power with another. For some, it was the dawn of true independence. For others, the start of a new kind of captivity. The island had turned on itself, and the reverberations would be felt far beyond its shores. By the early 1960s, Cuba was no longer just an island. It was a symbol. To Washington, it was a Soviet foothold less than 100 miles from Florida, a defiant challenge wrapped in the red banner of socialism. To Moscow, it was proof that communism could bloom in the very shadow of the United States. And to Fidel Castro, it was a fortress surrounded by hostile waters, living under the constant threat of invasion after the failed US-backed Bay of Pigs landing in 1961. The alliance between Cuba and the Soviet Union deepened quickly. Soviet oil fueled Cuban factories. Soviet technicians arrived to assist in industry and defense, and Soviet ships brought not just trade goods, but weapons. In 1962, this partnership took a perilous turn. Under an operation known as Anadir, the Soviet Union began secretly installing nuclear missiles on Cuban soil, missiles capable of reaching most of the continental United States within minutes. For Castro, the missiles were a shield. He believed another American invasion was inevitable, and nuclear deterrence might be the only thing to prevent it. For Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev, they were a bargaining chip, a way to offset U.S. missiles stationed in Turkey and Italy aimed at the USSR. But secrecy did not last. In mid-October 1962, American reconnaissance flights photographed the missile sites under construction. The images landed on President John F. Kennedy's desk like a warning bell. The U.S. response was swift: a naval quarantine of Cuba to block further shipments of weapons, coupled with a public demand for the missiles' removal. For 13 days, the world held its breath. In Havana, the streets filled with soldiers and militiamen digging trenches and building barricades. Anti-aircraft guns were positioned around key sites. Schools closed, and families stored food and water, unsure if they would live to see the next week. In Washington and Moscow, messages flew back and forth, some official, some through secret channels, balancing threats with offers. American warships shadowed Soviet freighters in the Atlantic. U.S. bombers sat loaded on runways, ready to strike. One miscalculation, one misunderstanding, could ignite a nuclear war. Castro, convinced that an attack was imminent, urged Khrushchev to launch a preemptive strike if the U.S. invaded. The Soviet leader, horrified by the possibility of total annihilation, instead sought a negotiated way out. On October 28, 1962, an agreement was reached. The Soviet Union would dismantle the missile sites in Cuba under UN inspection, and in return, the U.S. pledged not to invade the island. Secretly, Washington also agreed to remove its missiles from Turkey. The crisis ended without a shot fired, but its impact was lasting. Cuba emerged more isolated than ever, still under U.S. embargo, still bound to the Soviet Union, and now a permanent symbol of Cold War brinkmanship. For the Cuban people, those 13 days were a reminder that their fate could be decided in distant capitals, in rooms they would never see. The missiles left, but the shadow of that standoff lingered, etched into the island's memory like a scar. After the missile crisis faded from the headlines, Cuba settled into a long, unyielding posture, a socialist fortress anchored in the warm waters of the Caribbean. The U.S. embargo, first imposed in 1960, tightened into a near-total economic blockade. Ships from American ports could not enter Cuban harbors. Cuban sugar, once a staple of the U.S. market, was shut out entirely. The island turned fully toward the Soviet Union, not just for trade, but for survival. In exchange for sugar, nickel, and other commodities, the USSR supplied Cuba with oil, machinery, food, and billions of dollars in subsidies. Soviet engineers built factories, schools, and housing blocks. Advisors trained the Cuban military in modern tactics, while political cadres reinforced the ideological bond between Havana and Moscow. For Castro, this alliance was not merely strategic, it was existential. Without the Soviet lifeline, the revolution risked collapse. Domestically, Cuba embarked on massive social programs. Education became universal and free. Literacy campaigns reached the remotest villages, reducing illiteracy rates to some of the lowest in the world. Healthcare, also free, expanded rapidly. New clinics, hospitals, and vaccination drives reshaped public health. Infant mortality dropped and life expectancy rose. These were achievements Castro would point to as proof that socialism worked. But the successes came with costs. Political dissent was not tolerated. Newspapers, radio, and television were state-controlled. Opposition parties were banned, and those who openly criticized the government risked harassment, imprisonment, or exile. The Committees for the Defense of the Revolution, neighborhood watch groups loyal to the state, monitored daily life, blurring the line between community and surveillance. Cuba's role in the Cold War extended far beyond its shores. Throughout the 1970s and 1980s, Cuban troops and advisors fought in distant conflicts, supporting leftist movements and governments in Angola, Ethiopia, Nicaragua, and elsewhere. These interventions, coordinated with Soviet foreign policy, made the island a global player far disproportionate to its size. For some, this was solidarity. For others, it was an expensive gamble with resources desperately needed at home. In Havana, the Malecón still drew couples to watch the waves crash against the seawall. Music still spilled from doorways, rumba and sun intertwined with the new rhythms of Nueva Trova, songs of revolution and endurance. But shortages were a fact of life. Even with Soviet aid, the embargo meant that certain goods were rare, and ration books dictated the basics: rice, beans, sugar, oil. The island's economy, dependent on one primary export, sugar, remained fragile, its fate tied to prices set in faraway markets. And always, there was the tension of proximity. Less than 100 miles from Florida, Cuba lived under the gaze of a hostile superpower. Radio broadcasts from Miami beamed messages of dissent into Cuban homes. Exile communities, particularly in the United States, became both a political force and a constant reminder that the revolution had driven many from their homeland. For 3 decades, Cuba's story was one of survival within a carefully balanced equation. Soviet support on one side, U.S. hostility on the other. The balance held year after year until the day the Soviet Union itself began to crumble, and with it, the foundations of Cuba's world. In 1991, the Soviet Union dissolved, and with it vanished the lifeline that had kept Cuba's economy afloat for 3 decades. Overnight, trade collapsed. The ships that once arrived in Havana's harbor laden with oil, grain, and machinery simply stopped coming. Fuel supplies dwindled to a trickle, factories went silent, and public buses, once crowded but dependable, vanished from the streets. The government called it the Periodo Especial en Tiempo de Paz, the special period in peacetime. The phrase was bureaucratic. The reality was hunger. Without Soviet oil, tractors and irrigation pumps stood idle, and sugarcane harvests withered. Without Soviet food imports, store shelves emptied. Ration books offered less and less, until even staples like rice and cooking oil became scarce. People turned to bicycles for transportation, oxen for plowing, and rooftop gardens for survival. Electricity blackouts became a daily fact of life. In the cities, nights fell into darkness, broken only by candlelight in apartment windows. Refrigerators stopped running, meat spoiled within hours. Protein became a luxury. Eggs, chicken, or pork were rare finds. Many Cubans subsisted on a diet heavy in sweet potatoes, plantains, and whatever could be coaxed from small plots of land or bartered through informal networks. Yet necessity bred ingenuity. Urban agriculture flourished, with vacant lots transformed into organoponicos, organic gardens that fed neighborhoods. Doctors, faced with shortages of medicine and equipment, improvised treatments with herbal remedies and repurposed tools. Families raised rabbits or chickens in backyards, finding ways to stretch every calorie. But not all improvisation could mask the depth of hardship. Malnutrition spread, especially among children and the elderly. Bicycles clogged the streets not as a sign of environmental consciousness, but because gasoline was reserved for essential services. In some areas, people collapsed from hunger while waiting in ration lines. The government sought new sources of hard currency, opening the island to limited tourism. Foreign visitors brought dollars, and with them came a stark dual economy. Hotels and restaurants catering to tourists were stocked with goods unseen in Cuban homes. This divide, between those with access to dollars and those without, created a new form of inequality, one the revolution had once promised to erase. Politically, the state tightened its grip. Dissent was dangerous. Protests were rare and quickly suppressed. Still, frustration simmered beneath the surface. In 1994, the Maleconazo, a spontaneous protest along Havana's seawall, erupted into open defiance before being dispersed. That same year, thousands fled on makeshift rafts toward Florida, risking their lives in the Florida Straits. Some made it. Many did not. The special period lasted through most of the 1990s, slowly easing only when new trade partners emerged. Venezuela under Hugo Chavez, China, and a gradual increase in tourism. But the scars remained. An entire generation grew up knowing darkness without electricity, meals without meat, and a constant vigilance over how to make tomorrow's food stretch one more day. For Cuba, the special period was not just an economic crisis. It was a test of endurance. The island had faced invasions, embargoes, and isolation before. But this was different. This was a slow grind, a quiet siege, where the enemy was not an army at the gates, but the emptiness of the pantry and the uncertainty of how long one could survive it. By the dawn of the 21st century, Cuba was a survivor. It had endured conquest, slavery, revolution, and the near starvation of the special period. The economy had not returned to its Soviet-era stability, but it had found new footholds. Tourism, remittances from Cubans abroad, and selective reforms that allowed small private enterprises to emerge. Havana's streets still bore the crumbling facades of colonial mansions, their paint peeling under the salt air. But in their courtyards, life continued. Children playing, neighbors sharing scarce goods, musicians practicing in the afternoon heat. Fidel Castro's health began to decline, and in 2006, he formally transferred power to his younger brother, Raúl Castro. The transition was quiet but symbolic. A shift from the fiery oratory of Fidel to the more pragmatic tone of Raúl, who introduced modest economic reforms. Cubans could now buy and sell property, open small businesses, and access cell phones and certain consumer goods once restricted. The changes brought a flicker of possibility, but also the return of visible inequality. Those with family abroad or connections to the tourist economy prospered, while others remained tied to meager state wages. Internationally, Cuba found new allies. Venezuela, under Hugo Chavez, supplied oil in exchange for Cuban medical teams. China deepened trade ties. And for a brief moment, the relationship with the United States thawed. In 2014, Presidents Barack Obama and Raúl Castro announced a historic restoration of diplomatic relations. Embassies reopened. Some travel and trade restrictions were eased. American cruise ships docked in Havana, their passengers wandering the cobblestone streets, buying cigars and mojitos. For a moment, it seemed the Cold War's final embers might be cooling. But the warmth was short-lived. Changes in U.S. leadership brought a reversal. New sanctions, renewed restrictions, and the tightening of the embargo. The economic strain intensified, worsened by the collapse of Venezuela's economy, which cut oil supplies to the island. Blackouts returned, along with shortages of basic goods. Culturally, Cuba's identity remained defiant. Music, art, and sport continued to be sources of pride and international recognition. The Buena Vista Social Club's nostalgic sound carried Cuban rhythms to global audiences. Ballet, baseball, and boxing produced champions despite limited resources. The island's creative energy persisted even when material comfort did not. Yet beneath the surface, a new generation was restless. Many young Cubans, born after the Cold War, had no memory of the revolution's early promises. They were connected to the outside world through the slow but growing reach of the internet, and they compared their daily hardships with images of life abroad. In 2021, rare public protests broke out, fueled by economic shortages and demands for greater freedom. The government's response was swift, reasserting its authority, but also revealing the fragility of the social contract. In the 21st century, Cuba stands as both a relic and a participant in the modern world. Vintage cars rumble past Wi-Fi hotspots. Soviet-era slogans fade on walls, while entrepreneurs sell coffee from smartphones. The contradictions are everywhere. Between past and future, ideology and necessity, hope and fatigue. And still, the island endures, as it always has, in the tension between survival and change. Stand at the edge of the Malecón at dusk, and you can hear it. The low thunder of waves striking the seawall. The hum of voices drifting from balconies. The syncopated thump of a drum in some unseen courtyard. This is Cuba, as it has always been, layered with centuries of survival and song. An island where history is not confined to books, but breathed in the salt air, tasted in the sugar of a coffee cup, and carried in the cadence of its music. From the first Taíno settlements to the colonial ports, from the cane fields to the guerrilla trails, Cuba's story has been written in resilience. It has endured the diseases that erased its first peoples, the chains of slavery, the weight of empire, the crossfire of Cold War superpowers, and the hunger of the special period. Each era left scars, but also rhythms. The steady beat of work songs in the fields, the ceremonial pulse of bata drums at night, the quick shuffle of feet in a crowded dance hall. These rhythms have never been purely entertainment. They are memories set to sound. They carry the story of an island that has been both prize and prisoner, both rebel and host, both stage and pawn in struggles larger than itself. The drums speak of defiance, the guitars of longing, the voices of a refusal to disappear. Today, Cuba is still a contradiction, its streets lined with relics of another century, its people navigating the push and pull between tradition and necessity. The embargo still casts its shadow, shaping what can be bought, sold, or even imagined. The government still claims the mantle of revolution, even as younger generations weigh its promises against their own desires for change. Tourism brings hard currency, but also deepens divides. The internet connects Cubans to the wider world, but also exposes the fragility of what they have been told for decades. Yet no matter how the world turns, the island keeps its own time. The sea still strikes the shore as it did when Columbus first saw it, when Spanish galleons anchored in its bays, when rebel boats slipped in under cover of darkness. The wind still carries the scent of tobacco leaves drying in the hills and the sweetness of cane crushed in the mills. And the music, always the music, threads through every street, an unbroken line from the past to the present. Perhaps that is Cuba's greatest act of defiance, to keep playing, to keep dancing, to keep living, even when history seems determined to crush it. Empires have come and gone, flags have been raised and lowered, leaders have risen and fallen. But the rhythm remains, part heartbeat, part memory, part prophecy. Listen closely, and you might hear it. Not just a sound, but a vow. That no matter who claims the land, no matter what storms come from sea or sky, Cuba will not lose the beat that has carried it through every trial. And so, the island's story continues, measured not in years, but in the endless rhythm that refuses to fade.